One of the things that I think about very often is, as an organization, are we an organization that someone would want to be included in? Or are we inviting individuals into a place of toxicity?
Hi, thank you for joining us today. I'm Ludwig Lin, one of the hosts of Vital Times, the podcast. This is episode 2 of a panelist discussion that needs a sense of urgency and our full attention. The topic is, perioperative work culture is broken. How do we fix it? The panelists joining me today are Doctors Alyssa Burgart, Elizabeth Duggan, Jina Sinskey, and Amy Vinson. If you didn't get a chance to listen to the first half of the discussion covered in part 1, I highly recommend that you do to get a sense of the various elements that the panelists feel are impacting our work satisfaction. This episode focuses more on the action steps that we can all take to improve this. And with that, onward to the episode.
Hi, it's Jina. Something Beth said about psychological safety, especially for leaders, that really resonated with me. In medicine, a lot of people take on these leadership roles because they're great clinicians, great educators, great researchers. And unlike business, for example, it's not because they're specifically trained to be leaders. And so it can be really scary making these huge organizational changes. And one thing that when I talk to our leaders about is the concept of organizational justice. And Beth, of course, as an organizational psychology expert, can probably tell you more about this in greater detail, but there's 4 different types of organizational justice. Distributive justice is really when people perceive, is that fair or not? And I think that's what people think about when they think about organizational justice. But I wanted to kind of talk about the 3 other types of organizational justice, which is procedural, informational, and interactional. So procedural is really when people feel like the process, for example, the organizational decision-making, that was fair. The informational was, people were able to really get the rationale behind organizational decisions. And finally, interactional, where people felt like there was proper treatment and respect for the person. And so when people can't necessarily make a decision that's going to make someone happy because of lack of resources or whatever, I think those other 3 ways are a good way to think about how can we make this more fair for people when you don't really have a perfect answer. Because I think in medicine, the culture is such that we're all perfectionists and we don't want to do something unless we know that the outcome is going to be perfect. But if you can't get to perfect, those are some ways that I think you can move the needle towards better.
Yeah, this is Alyssa. I'll just throw in that making people happy, of course, is a pipe dream, but you can't always guarantee fair outcomes, but you're very unlikely to create the conditions to arrive at a fair outcome if you don't have a fair process. And that really points to all of the conditions that Jina just outlined so incredibly well. You really need to have processes that set you up for just outcomes. You can't expect that you're going to come to just outcomes by accident.
Let's talk about that for a second, and maybe Beth could be the expert on this. When we talk about asking, or let's just be a little bit more forthright, demanding for a just process, how do we get people to listen to that?
So, that's a little bit like 2 different questions, I think. So how do we instill justice, right? How do we want people to take on just processes in an organization? Again, I think it goes back to spelling out the benefits. And I think, Alyssa hit the nail on the head when she said this, is that we can't expect people to appreciate an outcome if they don't appreciate the process to get there. And so it's been pretty well shown in organizational literature that even if we disagree with the outcome, if we find the process leading to the outcome to be fair, we are far more likely to accept the outcome. And I think that'd be a fantastic spin to leaders. I shouldn't use the word spin because it's truth, but is that you can't make people happy all the time. But the processes, when they are fair, people can accept the decisions. And again, going back to what Jina said, involving interpersonal and informational justice is also critical in helping people remain a part of the organization, want to stay, believe in their leadership. And so I think that's really how you build just organizations is using these first 3 components of justice and aiming for just outcomes, but realizing it's not perfect, you can still build effective commitment with your colleagues and your employees when you are consistently practicing justice. And I think that's the other piece, is it has to be consistent. So one of the breakers in a just organization is inconsistent practices. So we want to make sure that if we're going to move forward in just organizations, that we tell the leaders they have to, really walk through these processes each and every time as they're making decisions.
Let me ask you a follow-up to that, Beth, which is, how does one continue to hold one's organization accountable to create just processes?
So I think each organization can approach this differently, but one of the ways to think about this is having the leadership team sit down and say, this year, what are our most important priorities? Right? Hopefully it's physician wellness. Obviously it's got to be some kind of financial component so that we all can keep the lights on and see patients. Perhaps it's having a more inclusive environment for employees. Perhaps it's serving a more inclusive patient population. But if you outline the 4 or 5 strategies that everyone can agree to, then as you go through these decision-making processes, you look at each one of those vision steps as you make decisions. So when you explain the decision, you can say, we specifically looked at physician wellness. These were the pros of this decision. These were the cons, right? And then you move to the next one. We looked at inclusive practices. These were the pros. These were the cons. This is not to say that these kind of vision steps need to be the same forever. Perhaps they'll change year to year as the organization grows, but it allows all of those watching the decision to understand where the where the weight happened as decisions were made, and it increases transparency. And there is no doubt that transparency is critical in decision making and information, like Jina said. When we lack information around decisions, we tend to make up stories. And so that's, to some degree called information asymmetry. When the leaders, we believe, have some information that we don't have, right? If they're not providing us the information, we tend to provide it for ourselves. And what those stories can or may be aren't always positive. And so we really want the leaders to be, again, transparent in providing the information at each step, because it allows us, again, that consistency in decision making.
Beautiful. It sounds like we're going back to what Jina had pointed out. You need to be at the table. Be at the table, be part of this process, and be able to distribute that information to make it more transparent.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what, we're moving towards. And I think we're starting to see healthcare institutions adapt, small steps towards change. And I think as we continue to talk about it, forums like this, I've heard all of these women speak and give inspiring lectures, but also just these work groups, these informal conversations. Each of these steps, I have to believe, lead to change. I think the alternative would be a bit too devastating to accept, but I'm feeling very positive and optimistic that we are starting to be able to impact and influence the future.
This is Alyssa. Something that I think is also important to recognize is that, obviously everyone here on this call is very committed to psychological safety, very committed to just outcomes. And I think one of the things that can be very disillusioning and very challenging, at least for myself, is that, not all leaders who are sitting at those tables, wherever those tables may be, whether they're in your department or in the hospital system or within, a larger organization, not everyone is going to be as open to these concepts as others. Some folks are going to be hostile towards them, and figuring out how to navigate those is a challenge. And it's an area of growth that I think has certainly been important for me as a leader in various areas. And I think recognizing that there are going to be individuals who have achieved some position of authority, who maybe you want them to be your accomplice and your partner in change, and they may not be as ready for that as you are. And learning to navigate that, I think it requires an immense amount of finesse, as well as kind of the internal grace to walk that path.
Hey, this is Amy. I agree with you. And you bring up a really good point, and that's this work is hard. This work is often isolating, and you often feel like you're out there all alone. And that's the reason I think everyone on this call has felt that way when taking a stand for these things in the past. I think that's why community matters so much. I think that's why part of the benefit of what we've seen during COVID is an enhancement of these national communities where I can hop on a Zoom with a couple well-being colleagues if I've got a challenge and I don't know how to handle it and chat with them about it. I think I've spoken with all of the people on this call, and that allows a degree of mentorship and sponsorship. And thankfully, in the well-being world, it's a nice culture. It's a mutually supportive culture within anesthesia, at least, which is the one I've been most steeped in. And, that's been one of the most amazing things I've seen in my career is just the number of people willing to lift up others to do this work, and build connections. And, I think that's one of the benefits when people ask me why I'm so invested in the work with like the ASA. It's these relationships that get made, and then real tangible work product comes from that. Real collaborations come from that, and we are able to push things forward. I think that connection on the national level and even international level is simply critical.
I love it. It's so inspiring to me as a, PL anesthesiologist looking for improvements. So thank you all for doing this. I would like to explore further something that had been mentioned previously, which is another organizational behavior concept. So Beth, I guess I'm looking to you to start it, and then we can all jump in. But this whole thought of behavior norming, how to get organizations to adapt behaviors that are constructive to everybody involved, and what are the challenges, what are the pitfalls?
That's also a great question. And we see behavioral norming generally in work groups. It's a bit harder at organizational levels. And so there's kind of less in the literature than there is in either small work groups or small organizations. And so to tackle this at healthcare level is very hard because there are so many people involved. But the key in behavioral norming is, first of all, involving everyone that is interested in participating. Now, clearly you can't do that with, 10,000 healthcare employees, but can you do it with their leaders and then take it down to small groups? I think you can. And the goal is to say what behaviors are acceptable here and what behaviors are really not acceptable. And as soon as I turn over, I'm going to pass this on to Alyssa because I think she has so much insight about some of the unacceptable behaviors that we're facing right now. But by doing this, we have a great way for people to engage in task conflict. We may not always agree with each other on how to do something or what the next steps are or what is most needed at the moment. But if we can agree on how we interact with each other, how we have that engagement, that when we talk to each other, we promote respect, we promote support, we value each other's contributions, it's been shown that we notably increase our potency and our capability to achieve an outcome, but also that, again, we build trust, we build shared mental models, meaning that we have an understanding of, again, how to do it the next time together, how to do it the time after that, and only to improve and improve again. But all of those things also keep employees wanting to come back to the job. They feel connected to their colleagues, connected to their work, and connected to their organization.
This is Alyssa. Beth talked about, kind of these behaviors that can be toxic. And, I call myself a dignity evangelist. Like, I'm a huge fan of dignity because, even if I don't maybe like somebody or if I've had a negative experience with them, I find that as long as I maintain my focus on their dignity as a human being, for me, that's something that's incredibly grounding and incredibly helpful. And I think we need organizations that are more focused on treating each other with dignity, because I think we have a lot of dignity violations that we don't recognize because we aren't thinking about them in that framework in terms of the ways that we treat each other, not just individually, but the way that our systems are designed to value or devalue us in particular ways. And so, again, I find dignity to be an incredibly valuable framework. And the other thing that I oftentimes think about, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion are very popular, and the concept's been around for a number of decades. One of the things that I think about very often is, as an organization, are we an organization that someone would want to be included in? Or are we inviting individuals into a place of toxicity? And that's, I think, something that oftentimes more performative DEI work really focuses on hiring in marginalized groups, hiring in people that are not represented, but not necessarily taking a hard look at what does this environment look like, and is this a safe environment to create diversity, to nurture these relationships, to nurture the human dignity of all of the people who are involved. And is this a place worthy of inclusion? And I think oftentimes we're not looking hard enough at our own organizations to really think critically about what would an organization worthy of inclusion look like? And how is it that we are systematically creating that environment?
Woo, that's a lot. That was a really important concept, I feel. Thank you, Alyssa, for saying that aloud, really. Can I ask you to elaborate further? I think in the popular literature now, there's talk of moral injury when people are doing things that isn't part of their expectation or the way they envision. There's this concept of moral injury. How does that fit into the way we process the various forces at work in the healthcare environment?
It's a great question. This is Alyssa. Moral distress is something that an experience that we have when we feel we're being pushed into behaviors or systems in which we do not feel we are in alignment with our values, with our ethical values, our ethical principles. And as caregivers, the stakes of our work are very high. The concept of moral injury was really, I've joked that over the past, 15 or 20 years, the moral distress literature has really been focused within academic nursing, and the burnout literature has really been focused in the medical literature. And it's been very interesting to watch the interplay and overlap, and kind of watching those two academic communities realize that they've been addressing very related issues from very different positions, and how it is that this is an opportunity to really learn from each other and to have that interdisciplinary anti-silo approach to care. And so when we talk about moral injury and we talk about moral distress, it is really challenging because, and this gets to Beth's point about how we make up stories, that if we don't have access to accurate information, we will fill in whatever information makes the most sense to us, which is often whatever is kind of the closest, easiest way to fill in that information. And so it's interesting in the work I do as an ethicist, we have a couple of programs that my group has started, which is we have something called moral distress rounds, where we have some opportunities for clinicians to really offload around difficult cases, specifically around concerns about moral injury, and having that opportunity to share that experience and share how it is that they're perceiving, if a nurse is saying, I'm being asked to provide these specific cares to this patient, and I'm concerned that they're not beneficial treatments, I feel like I'm doing something wrong. And then we come to find out that if you can get the clinical teams in the room, the physician teams in the room, that folks are seeing things in different ways because they have access to different information. And because our hospital systems they're so busy, they're so overwhelmed, the patient populations have become, more and more sick over time, the communication breakdowns can actually really fuel that moral injury. And so, again, finding ways for people to come together to make sure that not only that information is being shared effectively, but additionally that information is being tied specifically to our values, so that we understand what are the values that I bring to this patient care scenario, and how is it that I can ensure that I am living my values, I am working my values, and I am bringing those to be my best self in a clinical environment. And when you have a community of people who, again, share that human dignity model, share their values and their approaches to care, then you find that you can create those relationships that can be stronger and that can bond us through exceptional adversity. I'm going to pause there because I know that's been a lot.
I would love to hear a little bit more about this. What are the concrete things that we can do to share? I almost feel like this is an extension of those Schwartz rounds that people do about difficult clinical scenarios.
It's very much related to the Schwartz rounds model. I mean, the Schwartz Center obviously is an incredible organization. For anyone who's listening, I really hope you'll check them out. If you don't already have a Schwartz Center within your hospital, it's really, truly incredible. The program that we have is in addition to Schwartz rounds. It's a little bit more intimate, a little bit more private. We do try to very clearly and explicitly create psychological safety with those who appear for those individual sessions. We also have created something called an ethics liaison program through my colleague Heather Fitzgerald, which is something where we're actually providing really sort of ethics 101, bioethics 101 to ancillary staff throughout the hospital. So we have anesthesia techs, and we've got nurses, and we have respiratory therapists and nurses from all over the hospital. And we have people from sterile processing, and we have people from environmental services, and really trying to bring everyone together around a common language for these values and for our ethical principles, so that we're really trying to help make the moral community more robust very intentionally.
I like that. Thank you, Alyssa. I wanted to go from the organization in that level back to the individual, to each one of us as a physician, as an anesthesiologist, and thinking about what was mentioned earlier about the psychological contract that each of us signed to be part of this world. When our world changes the way it is now, or when we learn more and we reevaluate, those contracts need to be amended or be broken, I suppose. So how is that happening for all of us, and how do we help each one of us make that happen? Or is that even necessary? I wanted to pose that to all of you.
I think, whether we like it or not, the psychological contract exists. When we go into a work environment, we have an expectation of what the job will be, and again, what the job will provide. And so I think if we can train ourselves to proactively think about this relationship as it's developing, it's been shown that we're much less likely to enter this state of psychological contract breach. So when the psychological contract was initially studied, we were not quite in the knowledge economy yet. So the contract was more simple. It really rested a bit on, I'm working with, this set of people that I enjoy working with. I am treated with some modicum of respect in my job. I'm being, paid for overtime, or what kind of defines the product that I'm developing. But things have really changed in the last, probably 15 to 20 years as the knowledge economy has emerged. But I think more so to Amy's earlier point, as we're having these new generations enter medicine. So there was recently a study that looked specifically in the knowledge economy on what do employees most want in this psychological contract. And the first was quality of interaction, trust, mutual influence, being able to provide my ideas into my community, being respected for my work, having some degree of autonomy, being empowered, flexibility, which is something we haven't talked a lot about today, but is critically important in job satisfaction. And then again, much of what, Jina works on, which are these kind of supportive environments where you have, peer groups that really appreciate each other, and divergent skills and perspectives, and job resourcing, right? Are we being resourced and we're being offered development opportunities? These are very real concepts as people enter their jobs. So one of the things I always advise our leadership team, and we're getting better at, not yet perfect, but better, is to have these conversations around what are the other things in your job that you're looking for, and have an open conversation around these specific topics. What does social support look like here? What are the development opportunities available to you? When you want to share your ideas and opinion, what is the forum for that available to you? Who can you talk to? Where can you go? What type of public conversations are we having? Because what's been shown is that if you can, again, match those ideas early, you're much less likely to have a psychological contract breach. Now, the idea of breach is that we recognize something in the contract has not been honored. Oftentimes we live with that and we just keep moving forward. But over time, if multiple times your contract has been breached, or you have a very kind of big disruptive event, perhaps, this kind of ethical dilemma, this moral injury that Alyssa has been talking about, you move into something called psychological contract violation. And very interestingly, that has an affective component, right? It hurts. We feel that disappointment, frustration, and sometimes even anger. It has a behavioral component. Sometimes people will act out, right? They start talking about the organization, they gossip, they feel bitter, they subvert new activities. And then it has a cognitive component. We obviously recognize and think about what has happened to us. And that really is devastating for both employee and for the organization, because realigning at that point can be a challenge. And so our goal is, right, to hopefully never allow people to get to that point. And so we want to have an open door at the beginning of our relationship with each other, but all the way through. At any point where the contract seems to be changing, we want to open the door for a physician to come in and say, hey, this doesn't feel like the job I thought I was taking, and here's why. Because oftentimes that conversation can repair the contract and bring us back together and find meaning and find purpose, and re-deliver us to the job that we had hoped for.
This is Amy. Wow. I mean, you hit the nail on the head of so many things, and it just makes me think, reevaluating that contract when for the past 2.5 years, I think everyone in healthcare has been asked to do something different than they were doing, before the pandemic started. I think everyone has entered into a different kind of job than they were in 3 years ago, and just acknowledging that, I think, is really important. It wasn't a short-lived staffing issue. It has had long-standing ramifications. And I think about simplifying it down even further. People want to feel valued. They want to feel appreciated. They want to feel they are impacting things in a positive way, and that they're supported by their employer, where they spend a lot of their life and energy and time. And when we did the big burnout study of anesthesiologists that we're actually repeating right now, and we looked at demographic and practice factor issues that were associated with burnout. By far, the factor that was most associated with burnout was the question, how supported do you feel in your work life? And if someone said they had little to no support in their work life, their odds ratio for having the full burnout syndrome was 10, which is just astronomical. And so for me, when I gauge how folks are doing in my department, I don't ask a big, long survey instrument. I say, how supported do you feel in your work life? And then I ask, and I look for free text, what makes you feel supported? What makes you feel not supported? What's something we can change now that would improve your life? And what's something that needs to change but would take more time and investment? And I think that's what we all need to be doing is creating that place of psychological safety that Beth so eloquently outlined, putting in place organizational constructs that Jina spoke on in a just manner, where there is actual justice, actual accountability in all directions, and then finding out the nitty-gritty and doing something about it. And I think we can all be doing that as healthcare organizations at any size, shape, or organization, whether it's a private practice or academic practice, large or small. I think we can all be asking these questions, but it's going to take some confronting of how we've always done things. So I have loved hearing the perspective of the other women on this call. It has been inspirational to me today.
I'll second that feeling. This has been a really, we talk frequently, but to hear these, experts and leaders speak today, it's inspiring. I mean, it's just makes me feel so hopeful for the future. So thank you to all of you for such a lovely share.
I don't even feel like I need to come back to summarize things. That was so great. Thank you all. And Beth did a better job concluding this than I did. So I'm just going to stop right here. This is Ludwig Lin, and this is the California Society of Anesthesiologists Vital Times podcast series. I hope that we all were able to take some useful bits of information and strategy away from this. We will most likely come back with a elaboration of these topics in yet another future podcast. So thank you for listening.